The night the blizzard swallowed Whispering Pines, Elena Stone was 8 months pregnant and alone in a timber cabin beside a frozen Montana lake. Her husband, Navy SEAL Garrett Stone, was half a world away on a classified mission. Only Maverick, the Belgian Malinois Garrett trusted like family, stood watch. Then black snowmobiles raced across the ice. 12 men came up the buried dock path with papers, threats, and money behind them. They wanted Elena's family land. Elena said no. Maverick answered first. Blood hit the snow before the emergency call connected. From 8,000 miles away, Garrett heard enough to know exactly who had touched his family. By dawn, a Navy SEAL was coming home. A corrupt empire was about to be dragged into daylight, and a baby would arrive in the middle of a winter war. What time are you watching from? Please like, share, and subscribe to K9 and SEAL Stories, and now our story begins. By the second week of November, Elena Stone sat alone at the kitchen table with her sketchbook open in warm lamplight while the snowbound cabin creaked under a night of hard Montana wind, beyond the dark pines and the buried dock. One hand rested beneath her 8-month belly, and the other moved her pencil slowly, because drawing let her believe that winter still obeyed ordinary rules, and that Garrett's absence could be measured in days instead of worry. Maverick lay near the stove with his deep fawn coat glowing amber in the firelight, not fully asleep, only conserving energy the way disciplined dogs and deployed men often did. Elena checked Garrett's latest message again. The brief "safe love you" note routed through military channels, and the silence after reading it felt larger than the frozen lake beyond the glass. And hear his voice one more time. She stood and drifted toward the back window, not because she had heard something yet, but because loneliness sometimes made the dark look as if it were preparing to answer her. Maverick's head snapped up before she reached the curtain, his ears lifting in one clean motion, and his chest tightening with the low warning vibration Garrett had once called the sound before trouble. The dog crossed the room first, nails whispering across old planks, and planted himself beneath the frost-whitened pane as if an unseen line had just been crossed outside the cabin walls. Elena pulled the curtain aside and saw only weather at first, wind-skinned snow, black trees, and a frozen lake so still it looked hammered from dull blue steel. Then moving lights cut across the ice, low and fast, 6 black snowmobiles at first, and then more behind them, their beams bouncing sharply over the frozen surface toward the buried dock, like knives skipping over metal. The sight closed her throat instantly, because nobody who belonged to Whispering Pines traveled the lake in a storm like that unless they wanted to arrive unseen and leave quickly. She reached for the phone on the counter and stared at the emergency shortcut Garrett had programmed before deployment, thumb hovering while one weak bar of service blinked like a dying pulse. Garrett had told her never to argue with instinct. Yet for one fatal second, Elena tried to reason with dread and tell herself that approaching lights were only reckless locals and not targeted intent. The snowmobiles slowed near the dock, spread wide, and shut down in the hard wind, leaving 12 men to step onto the ice and move toward shore with expensive gear and unearned certainty. The man in front removed his helmet halfway up the path, shook snow from dark, slicked-back hair, and became unmistakably Donovan Cross, the county golden son who had never confused boundaries with consequences. Elena knew his face from the diner, from the grocery store, from the lazy confidence that clung to him in town, and from the 3 land purchase letters she had already burned unread after the first lines. Maverick moved in front of her before she consciously stepped back, lean body squared, black mask rigid, every line of him saying that the people coming uphill were now his problem, with the certainty of instinct older than language. The knock hit the front door so hard it rattled the frame, a demand instead of a request, followed by a second blow that made the cabin feel smaller and the night feel organized. Elena unlocked the door because hiding was no longer possible, because Donovan could already see her shadow through the side glass, and because fear with no movement becomes its own trap. When the door opened, winter rushed in with them, along with snow dust, cologne, and the smug body language of men who believed money had trained the world to step aside. Donovan smiled without warmth and greeted her politely enough to sound rehearsed, while 11 companions spread across the porch and yard to make sure politeness had plenty of witnesses. Elena told Donovan that her husband was away and that the visitors needed to leave immediately, but Donovan answered that he already knew Garrett was deployed and had timed the conversation accordingly. He spoke about generous offers and development opportunities as if he were discussing zoning at a luncheon, yet his boots edged closer to the threshold each time Elena refused to soften. And he said it with the ease of a man who had never once been denied. One of the men behind him lifted a clipboard full of transfer papers, exposing legal forms already prepared, and that single detail told Elena they had not come to negotiate anything. Donovan lowered his voice and explained that the Stone parcel was the last inconvenience blocking a $40 million lake project, which meant stubbornness had become more expensive than sentiment. Elena repeated that the land was not for sale, that Garrett would say the same thing, and that 3 generations of family did not become a resort because a rich boy wanted a better shoreline map. Maverick's growl deepened when Donovan let one boot cross the threshold line, and the sound made even the entourage hesitate, because dogs know when courtesy has ended before people admit it. Elena warned him to back away, but Donovan only smirked at the dog and asked whether this was the famous guard animal meant to make serious men feel threatened on a cold porch. A companion behind him snapped open a collapsible baton with a metallic click that cut through the storm, and Elena understood in one brutal instant that the show of paperwork had already failed. Maverick launched first, all speed and conviction, hitting Donovan high and tearing at the sleeve near his wrist, hard enough to erase his smile and replace it with genuine panic, aiming all that speed at the one body that mattered most in the doorway. Donovan jerked backward, swore, and one of his men drove a boot into Maverick's ribs so violently that the dog slammed into the porch rail before scrambling up again on pure will. Elena lunged toward Maverick, but 2 men moved at once, blocking her path and driving her against the cabin wall hard enough to send hot pain through her back and down into her hips. Someone barked that she was pregnant, and Donovan answered that she should have signed earlier, which stripped the last polite coating off the entire encounter and left only contempt underneath. Through the pain, Elena found the emergency shortcut inside her coat pocket and pressed it without looking down, because Garrett had built that one action into her muscle memory before leaving. The phone slipped from her hand into the snow on the porch and began to connect, bright screen glowing like a flare at their feet, before Donovan realized what she had done. From thousands of miles away, through military relays and impossible distance, Garrett Stone answered on the second ring with one word that changed the air around Elena instantly. Elena. She tried to shout a warning, but a hand caught her coat and dragged her back, while Donovan scooped up the phone and introduced himself with a smile meant for humiliation, not conversation. Garrett's voice turned cold the moment he heard the name, and even broken by the small speaker, it carried the unmistakable tone of a man who had just found the center of the threat and made the whole porch seem to flinch. Maverick, already limping and bloodied, launched again at Donovan's leg, buying Elena another split second while one of the attackers raised the baton with controlled, practiced violence. The blow landed across Maverick's side with a crack Elena heard inside her own ribs, and Garrett heard it too, because his silence on the line sharpened into something more frightening than shouting. Donovan mocked the distance between them, telling Garrett he was a long way from home, and Garrett answered with a promise so calm it sounded carved from steel rather than rage. Then Donovan crushed the phone under his boot, grinding the screen into the porch boards and trying to sever the only line between the storm in Montana and the fury racing toward it overseas. He thrust the transfer papers and pen at Elena again, while the men crowded closer, expecting fear, pain, and pregnancy to finish what intimidation had started when politeness failed. Elena looked past Donovan to Maverick, bleeding in the snow, chest heaving, dark eyes still locked on her as if he had no right to surrender while she remained standing. Something inside her hardened then, not because she stopped being afraid, but because bravery and exhaustion sometimes meet in the same place and refuse to move apart. She took the pen, bent over the signature line, and wrote "Go to hell" in large, furious letters that none of Donovan's money could edit back into obedience. The sirens began as a faint tremor from the county road, barely audible under the storm at first, yet loud enough to make the men behind Donovan glance toward their machines and reassess the risk. Donovan read the words, went white with disbelief, and for a second Elena thought he would hit her, but the approaching sound of law enforcement broke the moment into retreat instead of escalation. He spat a final threat about the sheriff writing a different story by morning, then turned and drove his men back toward the snowmobiles, leaving churned drifts, blood, and broken glass behind. While winter kept falling around them as if nothing at all had changed. Elena dropped into the snow beside Maverick the instant they were gone, pulled the wounded Malinois into her lap, and held him against her belly while the red-blue promise of distant sirens climbed the road. 8,000 miles away, Garrett Stone stood perfectly still inside a red-lit communications tent after the line died, because every scream, every plea, and every blow against Maverick still echoed in his head. Through every rigid breath he took, he set the cracked handset down with controlled care and walked out into the frozen compound before rage made him break something useful, which was exactly the kind of decision training exists to teach. Wade Holland intercepted him halfway across the camp and read the answer in Garrett's face before words arrived, the way only men who had survived war together ever learned to do. Garrett told Wade that Elena had been attacked, that Maverick had taken the hits meant for her, and that distance had become the cruelest weapon in the whole encounter. Lieutenant Commander Hayes was waiting in the operations trailer when Garrett entered, screens glowing behind him, because bad news travels faster than helicopters through a live classified mission. Garrett asked for emergency leave without preamble, and Hayes answered with operational reality. But neither man in the room could pretend this was now only a scheduling discussion. When Garrett said his 8 months pregnant wife had been assaulted in their home by at least a dozen men, the trailer changed from command space into a place where moral priorities had to declare themselves. Hayes reminded him that extraction would take hours and that abandoning mission status came with legal consequences, yet Garrett told him flatly that a court-martial would have to wait behind family survival. Wade backed that statement without drama because some truths between soldiers are not theatrical. They are simply the line that remains after everything has been burned away. Hayes finally authorized 72 hours of emergency leave, the maximum he could justify without starting a political fire. and Garrett accepted the window like a man accepting oxygen after near drowning. Even before the extraction plan was finalized, Wade had Logan Pierce and Colt Bennett moving stateside, because loyalty forged under fire does not wait for paperwork when a family home has been violated. Logan promised cameras and digital coverage before dawn, while Colt promised eyes from the high ground, and both men sounded exactly as Garrett needed them to sound, already in motion. Back in Montana, Sheriff Dale Briggs reached the cabin 23 minutes too late and found Elena in the mudroom with blood on her coat, swelling on her face, and Maverick barely conscious in her arms. Briggs said her allegations were serious in the careful tone of a man already editing them for other ears, and Elena answered that facts did not become allegations merely because powerful people disliked witnesses. He wanted her formal statement at the station first, but Elena told him that if Maverick died while he chased paperwork, the memory would outlive whatever career he thought he was protecting, in the eyes of the law, and anyone still capable of shame. Briggs looked at the dog, looked away, and finally called ahead to Patricia Morgan's clinic, surrendering to the one moral truth in the room that could still shame him into action. Elena drove through the storm one-handed, because the other stayed on Maverick's body the whole time, feeling for every shaky breath as if she could hold life in place by refusing to let go. At the veterinary clinic, Patricia Morgan took the Malinois from her without wasting a second and called for warm fluids, trauma prep, imaging, and every other thing that might outrun internal bleeding. Elena refused treatment for herself, so Patricia ordered her into a chair instead and announced that anyone bleeding while claiming to be fine had already surrendered the right to self-diagnosis. Maverick vanished behind the treatment room doors under bright fluorescent light, and Elena sat in the waiting room with a split lip, aching ribs, and a phone screen full of nothing after Donovan's boot. At 1:20 a.m., a local news site pushed a short item describing a misunderstanding at the Stone property involving an aggressive dog, and Elena understood instantly how deep Donovan's reach already ran. Patricia finally emerged hours later with exhaustion in her face and blood on her scrubs, but she was smiling, and that single impossible smile broke Elena harder than grief had managed to. Maverick had 2 cracked ribs, a concussion, deep bruising, and enough stubbornness to annoy death itself, which Patricia delivered as medical assessment and reluctant praise in the same breath. By dawn, Logan had cameras on the approach road, Colt had positioned himself above the lake, and Wade had started building a file on the Cross family that looked less like business and more like organized rot. Garrett landed on American soil 28 hours after the call, transferred through military channels, and climbed into a black SUV with Wade before his boots had properly adjusted to home country cold. During the drive north, Wade briefed him on Donovan's sealed assaults, Victor's lakefront acquisitions, bribed influence, and the ugly rumor that anyone resisting cross-development eventually suffered some freak misfortune. Garrett scrolled through polished photos of Donovan in clubs and at charity events, and thought how often war had taught him that the most dangerous entitled men preferred smiling pictures to honest mirrors. The mountains reappeared as the road climbed toward Whispering Pines, and the first glimpse of the cabin around a snowy bend thinned every layer of control Garrett had built during the journey, and the sight of it felt almost like surfacing after too long underwater. Logan met them at the tree line, reported no hostile return since early morning, and told Garrett that Elena was inside, and Maverick had been brought home against veterinary advice because Elena would not leave him elsewhere. Garrett walked toward the front door, with hands that had steadied under gunfire shaking for the first time in years, because this ground mattered in a way no battlefield ever had. Elena opened the door before he knocked, and when he saw the bruising on her mouth, cheek, and shoulder, All the cold, disciplined language inside him nearly failed at once. Then she crossed the space between them, and he caught her carefully, because protecting her now meant understanding that even an embrace had to account for injury, pregnancy, and delayed terror. She told him that Maverick had saved her, that Donovan had chosen the timing because Garrett was away, and that the sheriff was already trying to bend the story before anyone else touched it. Garrett answered only that he was here now, but Elena could feel from the saw he held her that his arrival had not ended anything. It had only changed who the danger belonged to. Maverick lay near the stove wrapped in blankets and veterinary bandages, yet when Garrett knelt and touched forehead to fur, the dog managed one weak tail thump like a soldier saluting after the battle. Garrett thanked him for holding the line, and the words were quiet enough that only Wade nearby heard them, but that did not make them any less formal or any less true. That night, the kitchen table became a command post, with maps, laptops, thermal images, county records, and the kind of silence men keep when violence is still deciding whether to return immediately or later. Logan explained the likely approach routes. Colt marked the ridge and frozen lake as exposure points, and Wade laid out the first hard evidence that cross-pressure had ruined other families long before the Stones. Garrett said that men like Donovan escalate when embarrassment replaces certainty, because humiliation is the one tax privilege never expects to pay publicly. Wade answered that if escalation was coming, they needed federal eyes before the county machine buried evidence under local loyalty, snow, and money, which nobody at the table argued against. Elena listened from the living room doorway long enough to know they were already planning beyond defense, and then went back to sit beside Maverick, one hand on the dog and one on her unborn daughter. The cabin felt different with Garrett home, not safer exactly, but sharper, as if the walls themselves had chosen a side now that the storm no longer found only one woman waiting inside. Garrett studied the map again, then the porch where Elena had been cornered, and understood that distance had denied him the first answer, but would not deny him the second. He decided before midnight that Donovan Cross would be visited face-to-face the next morning, not because rage demanded spectacle, but because some predators mistake silence for permission until someone knocks back. Outside, the frozen lake lay white and empty, as if it had never carried 12 men toward the house. But everyone inside the cabin knew stillness and innocence were no longer the same thing. Before sleeping in broken fragments, Garrett checked every door, every window, and every dark corner of the house his grandfather had built, turning memory into perimeter with each step. Elena finally rested only after Garrett sat beside the bed and promised that no one would touch her again without going through him first, which was not comfort so much as an oath. He stayed awake long after her breathing evened out, listening to the stove settle, Maverick's restrained pain, the wind shift over the lake, and the shape of a coming confrontation becoming clear. By the time gray morning began pressing at the windows, Garrett had stopped being only a husband coming home in fury and had become something colder, steadier, and far more dangerous to the people waiting across the county. Morning arrived as a paler shade of gray rather than real sunlight, and Garrett sat in the mudroom lacing his black combat boots, while the cabin held that thin, watchful silence families know before somebody leaves toward danger. Elena found him there in one of his field jackets, half husband and half operator again, and touched the front of his coat as if confirming that this version of him still belonged to home. Garrett told her he was not going to start a war on anyone's porch, but Elena answered that she was not afraid of violence beginning there. She was afraid of what returning violence might carve into him. He kissed her forehead, rested his palm against the moving curve of her belly, and promised to bring himself back, which was the only reassurance Elena wanted badly enough to measure. Victor Cross's estate rose over the western ridge above the lake like wealth trying to impersonate permanence, complete with heated drives, stone pillars, cameras, and a gate built to confuse intimidation with architecture. Wade drove while Garrett reviewed Logan's notes, tracing years of shoreline acquisition, zoning pressure, shell company purchases, and the single stone parcel that kept Victor's resort dream from sealing the entire lakefront privately. Garrett said that this had begun as a land grab, but had become something more volatile once Donovan turned public humiliation into personal obsession. And Wade agreed, because rich sons usually escalate before they reflect. The front gates opened without argument when the guard heard the name Garrett Stone, which told Wade and Garrett that someone inside had decided intimidation worked better when it looked like confidence. Donovan waited in the grand hall under a chandelier large enough to feel insulting in winter, his wrist bandaged where Maverick had bitten through privilege and straight into skin. He welcomed Garrett with a brittle smile that never reached his eyes, and Garrett answered by telling him plainly that there had been no disagreement at the cabin, only assault. Donovan tried to reduce the attack to a misunderstanding and a property conversation gone sideways, yet even he could not keep the panic from flickering when Garrett described Elena's bruises and Maverick's cracked ribs. Victor Cross descended the staircase at exactly the right dramatic pace, silver-haired and perfectly composed, every movement calibrated to remind visitors that power in his house wore a calm face and expensive wool. He apologized for his son's poor judgment in the language of a man accustomed to buying damage after authorizing it, then offered money for medical expenses, repairs, and a revised purchase price. Garrett said no before Victor could finish the number, and when Victor noted that emotional men often made expensive mistakes, Garrett replied that the truly expensive mistake in this county belonged to his son. Victor asked what Garrett wanted, expecting perhaps a settlement dressed as justice, but Garrett demanded a public apology, written withdrawal from the property, and full cooperation with law enforcement not owned by the Cross machine. That last phrase made Victor study him harder, because it suggested outside leverage, strategy, and timing instead of the simple revenge he had prepared to dismiss as temporary heat. Garrett placed a USB drive on the marble table between them and explained that it contained copies of property transfers, subcontractor payments, suspicious fires, campaign money, and offshore routes that looked remarkably like laundering. Donovan laughed too quickly. Victor did not touch the drive at all, and Wade stood just far enough behind Garrett to remind the room that silence can also function as pressure when properly placed. Garrett said that if anything further happened to Elena, the baby, Maverick, the cabin, or any witness tied to Cross activity, the full packet would move simultaneously to federal agencies, media outlets, and people who hated public corruption on camera. Victor answered that Garrett seemed very sure of himself, and Garrett replied that he was not sure of himself at all. He was sure of the kind of men standing in front of him. He left before Victor could reclaim control of the exchange, and Wade said in the SUV that the meeting had applied either exactly enough pressure or far too much, probably both. On the drive back, Logan reported encrypted payments from cross-linked accounts into a Wyoming security cutout used to hire former military contractors, the kind of men who specialized in deniable removals and expensive silence. Garrett asked how many. Logan said anywhere from 6 to 20 or more, and the answer changed the texture of the entire day because private intimidation had just upgraded into organized violence. When the cabin reappeared through the snow, Garrett stopped seeing it as a damaged home and started seeing it as a target package requiring sensors, fallback positions, communication layers, and documented lines of approach. Colt seated motion sensors in the tree line. Logan wired cameras and repeaters beneath the eaves. Wade reinforced the mudroom windows, and Garrett checked every lock until the habit became ritual. Patricia Morgan arrived that evening through fresh snow to recheck Elena and Maverick, took one look at the fortified room, and dryly observed that the decorating choices felt aggressive but appropriately motivated. She examined Elena's blood pressure, bruised ribs, and rising exhaustion, then announced that the body only pretends to be optional for so long during late pregnancy and trauma recovery. Elena answered that rest sounded fictional under the circumstances, which made Patricia glance toward the dark windows and admit that medicine had no strong rebuttal for that particular environmental factor. Maverick tolerated his recheck with offended patience, his bandaged ribs lifting carefully while his eyes tracked Garrett whenever the seal moved, as if pain had not rescinded duty and never would. Patricia then lowered her voice and shared what she had heard in town. Strange trucks on the West Road, hushed conversations, and the kind of rumor pattern that means professionals have entered a local problem. She also revealed that a polished caller from Helena had contacted the clinic asking specifically whether she had treated a Stone family dog, which made Logan identify the likely shadow behind the inquiry almost immediately. Helena plus Cross money pointed neatly toward Senator Harlan Blackwood, a state kingmaker with clean campaign commercials, dirty proximity to development deals, and a 2-year FBI file nobody had successfully completed yet. Garrett decided then that if the county was compromised and mercenaries were mobilizing, the Stones needed federal attention before snow, fear, and donations blurred the truth into another local inconvenience. He called Rachel Foster in Billings, summarized the assault, the property coercion, the sheriff, the evidence packet, and the contractor threat, and Rachel's voice sharpened sentence by sentence as the picture widened. She warned him that if even half the file was real, he had just stepped on a hornet's nest spread across years of buried complaints, political favors, and expensive accidents masquerading as bad luck. Rachel promised to move at first light with a small team, but she also made one thing painfully clear. Until federal authority physically arrived, the cabin still belonged to the people willing to reach it fastest. After the call, Garrett stood at the window overlooking the frozen lake, feeling how beautiful winter can look when it has not yet been forced to reveal what it is helping conceal. Elena joined him and asked for the full truth, not the husband's edited version, and Garrett told her about Blackwood, the mercenary money, the compromised county, and the likelihood that pressure would turn into action before dawn. She asked where he wanted her if the attack came, and Garrett outlined the safe room, the go bag, the phones, and the non-negotiable order that she would leave with Wade if the situation demanded it. Elena kissed him and told him not to die proving anything, a sentence as gentle as prayer and as hard as command, because love in houses like theirs rarely separates tenderness from strategy. The first motion sensor chimed at 11:41 p.m., small electronic sound, enormous consequence, and every person inside the cabin instantly understood that prediction had just turned into contact. Logan's voice came over comms reporting multiple moving elements along the West Ridge, the South Tree Line, and the Frozen Lake approach, all too disciplined to be reckless locals or panicked rich boys. Colt confirmed thermal signatures with body armor and suppressed weapons, which ended any remaining illusion that cross-retaliation would resemble the previous night's drunken cruelty and not something more professional. Garrett looked once toward the reinforced safe room, where Elena would soon be placed, and felt that old military calculus meet something more intimate and more dangerous than duty. He told Elena to move to the safe room immediately, and this time she did not argue, perhaps because refusing to argue was the only honest way to admit how real the threat had become. Maverick limped after her despite Patricia's orders from earlier, pushed through the doorway, and took up position as though the pain in his ribs had simply joined the list of things he meant to ignore. Wade locked and then reopened the control on the safe room so Elena retained agency from inside. A small choice that mattered because helplessness had already done enough damage to the house. Outside, the cameras kept feeding clean snow, dark pines, and approaching shapes into Logan's system. While inside the cabin, the family ceased being a recovering victim household and became the target at the center of an incoming winter siege. By the time the next sensor chimed, nobody in the cabin was hoping the night would stay quiet anymore. They were only deciding how much of its violence they could force into the open before it reached the walls. The second motion sensor chimed at 11:43, and from that instant, every sound inside the cabin became a clock hand moving toward collision rather than merely a detail in the dark. Garrett stood in the front room with Wade beside him, Colt on overwatch above the property, Logan on encrypted comms, and the knowledge that a timber house could be reinforced but never mistaken for a fortress. Logan reported that the West Ridge team had split into 3 disciplined elements, while additional signatures advanced from the South Tree Line and the Frozen Lake, proving Victor had paid for planning instead of swagger this time. Colt confirmed suppressed rifles, night optics, and professional spacing, and Wade muttered that Cross had finally stopped hiring spoiled friends and started renting people who knew how to erase inconvenient homes. Garrett looked once toward the safe room where Elena sat with the go-bag, 2 phones, emergency blankets, and Maverick refusing every suggestion that wounded dogs should act like patients during hostile movement. He told Wade that they could not hold a determined direct assault for long against numbers like these, which was less fear than simple mathematics spoken aloud before panic could lie about odds. Wade asked for the play, and Garrett answered that if they could not overpower the attack physically, they would have to destroy the privacy the attackers had been paid to protect. Logan understood immediately and began routing every hidden camera feed to mirrored cloud servers, emergency reporting channels, and public platforms whose algorithms loved violence almost as much as corrupt men feared exposure. He warned that once the stream went live, control would be gone forever. And Garrett said that was precisely the point, because secret crimes survive on containment more than strength. The first round shattered the porch light instead of flesh, a calculated message that the men outside were still offering pressure before commitment. And then a voice came through a megaphone from the tree line. Cole Ramsey introduced himself as the contractor in charge, named the armed team as private security acting for a client, and offered safe removal for the lawful occupants in the same bored tone men use when rehearsing lies. Garrett answered from inside, naming Ramsey's former Delta background and later mercenary work, which forced a brief silence outside because professional predators dislike being seen too clearly by the people they approach. Rachel Foster came onto Garrett's secure line at that exact moment and told him not to go outside simply to indulge his flair for dramatic gestures, which meant she already grasped the kind of man he might become under pressure. Garrett replied that he was not interested in drama, only leverage, and then stepped onto the porch unarmed anyway, because the message had to be visible to the cameras as well as the guns. Snow whipped across the yard while hidden lenses watched from eaves, trees, dock posts, and the dark face of the bird feeder Logan had transformed into evidence collection. Garrett told Ramsey that the entire operation was being broadcast live, including faces, vehicles, thermal signatures, and tactical approach patterns, and the silence that followed sounded more shocked than angry. Ramsey called it a bluff, But Garrett calmly invited him to search Whispering Pines on his phone. And inside the cabin, Logan announced that viewer counts were already climbing past 5 digits. That number mattered because the men outside were not zealots. They were contractors. And contractors think very differently once headlines, timestamps, and facial recognition enter the invoice. Several infrared dots shifted as mercenaries checked devices, lost discipline, and discovered that their professional invisibility had just been dragged into the same winter light the Stones had spent 2 nights trying to survive. An open tactical channel then cracked with panic from somebody higher in the chain, ordering immediate abort because the feed had reached newsrooms, watchdog accounts, and federal listeners far faster than expected. Ramsey stepped partly into view by a pine trunk at the yard line, looked at Garrett across the snow, and admitted without saying the words that the mission had been bought private and was now irreversibly public. Garrett told him that what waited ahead was no longer merely a failed job, but federal conspiracy tied to a filmed assault on a pregnant woman's home, and he should consider retreat a gift. Ramsey gave one sharp signal, and the line outside fractured in reverse, South team pulling first, then the lake approach, then vehicles turning under dead headlights and spraying snow back toward the ridge road. Within 90 seconds, the siege had reversed itself, the dark around the cabin changing from controlled attack geometry into the messy withdrawal pattern of men desperate to leave before their names attached permanently to the footage. Only after Logan confirmed most of the force was moving west did Wade unlock the safe room, because relief without verification is how families die 1 false minute too early. Elena emerged pale but upright, and Maverick limped beside her with ears hard forward, bandages visible, every instinct in him still waiting for the next strike instead of believing retreat too quickly. She crossed toward Garrett, as if the danger had finally given her permission to feel her body again. But halfway there, her face tightened sharply, and one hand went low across her abdomen. Garrett caught her before the second contraction bent her, and suddenly the tactical map, the feeds, and the retreating mercenaries all shrank before a different emergency no rifle could stop. Elena tried to call it stress, maybe Braxton Hicks, but the pain came lower and stronger, and the experienced look that crossed Wade's face told Garrett denial would not hold this line either. Logan said Patricia was already on the road, because she had seen the stream, and Rachel's convoy was less than 20 minutes out. But 20 minutes can feel like betrayal when a child chooses it as timing. Another contraction took Elena's breath and convinced Garrett that their daughter had heard enough gunfire, enough hatred, and enough winter to decide she was done waiting for a safer calendar. Federal SUVs arrived first in a spray of headlights and chain-thrown slush, and Rachel Foster climbed out, took in the deserted perimeter, the embedded cameras, and Elena doubled over by the counter, then muttered that the situation had become offensively complicated. A medic reached Elena before anybody finished talking, while Rachel's agents swept for remaining hostiles, collected dropped casings, and marked the assault lanes that the whole country had now watched unfold live. Patricia Morgan skidded into the driveway moments later in her old truck, pushed through the front door with a medical bag and zero respect for scene hierarchy, and took command the instant she saw Elena's expression. She announced that everyone useful would help and everyone else would move, which in practice meant the nursery became a delivery room, while the front room became an evidence center, and the porch remained a battlefield with snow on it. Maverick followed Elena despite his ribs and positioned himself at the bedroom threshold, proving again that pain and duty occupy different categories in a working dog's mind, unless death closes both at once. Wade and Colt reset the perimeter, even though the attackers had withdrawn, because men like Victor and Blackwood rarely accept public humiliation without immediately searching for some new private angle. Rachel distributed her agents in a wider ring, called in additional resources, and told Garrett with dry irritation that his live stream stunt had probably saved his family and definitely made several future hearings more interesting. Inside the nursery, Patricia built order out of chaos with towels, warm water, clipped instructions, and the kind of battlefield calm that allows exhausted people to borrow competence when their own runs out. Garrett stayed beside Elena, offering hands she could crush and words he doubted she heard, because labor strips men down to the honesty that they can witness pain, respond to it, and still never control it. Between contractions, Elena managed to laugh once at how terrified he looked, and Garrett admitted the truth, which somehow steadied her more than any polished reassurance he might have invented. The cabin itself seemed to hold two realities at once now. Outside, retreat tracks, federal lights, broken snow, and the exposed machinery of corruption. Inside, breath counts, blankets, heartbeat checks, and a child arriving through violence toward life. Rachel stepped into the doorway once with the first major update, telling Garrett that Victor's mansion had gone dark and Donovan's location was no longer fixed, which meant retreat on one front had already triggered motion on another. Garrett absorbed that information with the numb clarity of a man required to care about two battlefields at once, then turned back when Elena gripped his wrist and reminded him without speaking which one needed him first. Patricia watched him make that choice and nodded once, as if the decision to remain present could itself be treated as a medical intervention, and perhaps the most necessary one available. As midnight gave way to deeper night, the baby moved relentlessly inside Elena. The FBI secured the property, the internet fed on the stream, and the storm over Whispering Pines changed from blizzard into frozen witness. The mercenary assault had failed. Victor's secrecy had shattered. And yet the hardest part of the night had only just begun because courage had shifted from porch defense to childbirth, without granting anyone time to change shape between them. By the time Patricia finally said they were past waiting and fully into labor, Garrett understood that winter had brought his family to the edge of destruction only to force them, in the same breath, into new life. The next hours stopped feeling like time and started feeling like weather moving through human bodies, because every minute in the cabin carried both the fading shock of the assault and the mounting force of birth. Patricia converted the unfinished nursery into a functioning delivery room, with the ruthless efficiency of a woman who had learned long ago that panic is simply wasted movement wearing dramatic clothing. Rachel's agents sealed the perimeter, photographed shell impacts, tagged abandoned approach points, and built an outer ring of federal presence that the county had never once provided the Stones when it mattered most. Wade and Colt rotated watch outside, rifles slung and radios open, while Logan preserved every second of the stream and fed mirrored copies into legal and media channels before any local hand could reach a delete key. Maverick settled beside Elena's half of the bed, breathing carefully through his rib pain and refusing all suggestions that he protect anyone from a more comfortable location than the threshold itself. Patricia caught Elena's chin during one brutal contraction and ordered her to look up, not down, because fear likes to push women inward, and she needed Elena facing the pain instead of folding around it. Elena did as told and held Patricia's eyes with the same furious discipline that had made her write defiance across transfer papers while men towered over her in the snow. Garrett stayed close enough for Elena to crush his hand and far enough not to interfere, learning the strange military truth that the most important work in some battles is simply refusing to leave. Between contractions, Elena managed to ask whether he was terrified, and Garrett answered honestly that he had never felt more useless in his life, which for some reason made her smile through the pain. Rachel appeared in the bedroom doorway once with news that Sheriff Briggs had been detained after federal agents compared his first report draft to the assault scene and found the truth missing almost line for line. She appeared again later to say the live stream had erupted nationwide, crossing from Montana news to national coverage, watchdog groups, veteran networks, and every corner of the internet that recognizes clear evil when it sees it. At 2:03 a.m., she brought harder news still. Victor Cross's mansion was dark. Donovan was off the map, and an intercepted message ordered someone to move records before daylight, because Blackwood wanted no loose paper left breathing. Rachel laid 3 photos on the front room table between wet gloves and evidence bags. Sarah Klein, the county records clerk, a box truck near White Elk Pass, and Donovan beside Senator Harlan Blackwood. She explained that Sarah kept duplicate easement archives and historical transfer records, which meant any effort to erase years of land corruption would naturally begin by forcing her to produce or destroy the paper trail. Garrett understood immediately that the Cross network was trying to survive the cabin failure by burning history before federal daylight pinned it to names, addresses, and signatures. He also understood something worse, that every instinct in him wanted to leave immediately, while every vow in him refused to walk away from Elena with labor still gripping her body. Rachel said she was not asking him to choose revenge over family, only whether he knew the pass and the abandoned survey routes better than the men trying to use them for cleanup. Elena solved the moral geometry before he could, listening from the bed with hope still inside her, and telling him plainly that if Sarah Klein disappeared, other families would keep paying for Stone blood with their own silence. Garrett argued that Rachel had agents and roads, and Elena answered that Rachel had roads, yes, but Garrett had instincts, mountain memory, and the kind of tactical reading Blackwood's hired men would not expect in a civilian case. Patricia objected on medical grounds to anyone discussing mountain raids beside a laboring woman, but even she could not deny that the witness and records mattered if justice was supposed to outlast tonight's headlines. Then Hope Elizabeth Stone made the argument theoretical no longer by arriving at 2:47 in the morning, 6 weeks early, loud enough to make every adult in the room forget corruption, guns, and evidence for one pure second. Patricia checked the baby, smiled with exhausted relief, and laid Hope on Elena's chest, where new life met bruised strength and instantly transformed the emotional architecture of the whole house. Garrett touched one tiny hand and felt Hope's fingers close around him with absurd force, which cracked something inside him open and reorganized it into a father before he had time to process the promotion. Elena looked wrecked, radiant, and wildly alive all at once, and when she whispered that their daughter was beautiful, Garrett could only nod because language had become too small for the room. Maverick limped forward when Patricia permitted it, lowered his nose carefully toward the blanket, and seemed to register the newest member of his pack with solemn professional approval before easing himself down beside the bed. For a brief half-hour, the cabin held peace. Baby sounds, Elena breathing, Patricia cleaning and checking, Wade swearing quietly at the doorway in the universal language of emotionally compromised men. Then Rachel returned with the rest of the truth, setting the photos and intercepts in front of Garrett and telling him that if Blackwood felt cornered, the next hours would be spent erasing records, witnesses, and anyone still holding originals. Sarah Klein's disappearance, the box truck near White Elk Pass, and Blackwood's sudden proximity to Donovan all pointed to one conclusion. The network had chosen the mountains as its last paper furnace. Garrett looked from the table to the bedroom, from the evidence to Elena and Hope, and felt family-first instinct collide with the colder knowledge that family safety would remain temporary unless the larger machine was broken completely. Elena saw that collision in his face and, despite the exhaustion of labor and blood loss, told him that their daughter deserved a county where men like Cross and Blackwood no longer owned the ending. She said that if Sarah vanished and the ledgers burned, then what happened to the Stones would simply become tomorrow's blueprint for another frightened family with less visibility and no dog like Maverick to buy time. Garrett hated that she was right, not because the logic failed, but because love resents being forced to share a room with duty so quickly after birth. Wade ended the argument by announcing he was going whether anyone approved or not, and Colt volunteered before being asked, because some teams remain teams long after uniforms stop issuing the paperwork. Logan began rerouting his mobile command truck toward White Elk Pass, overlaying forestry routes, snow depth, contractor satellite pings, and old Alpine survey station maps over current weather feeds. Maverick tried to rise when Garrett turned toward the door, and Patricia snapped that the veterinarian's opinion on wounded dogs mattered, but Elena smiled weakly and said the dog would scream the house down if left behind. Garrett crouched in front of Maverick, and the Malinois pressed his nose once against Garrett's wrist with the stubborn certainty of someone volunteering for another shift before the previous one had healed. Before leaving, Garrett bent over the bed, kissed Elena on the forehead, kissed Hope's tiny cap, and promised to come back before winter could take any more from the room than it already had. Elena, still pale and fierce beneath the blankets, told him to end it the right way, not the easy way, which was both permission and command, and exactly the kind of sentence only she could deliver to him. Rachel assigned 2 agents to the mountain convoy, promised simultaneous moves against Cross Properties and Blackwood's offices, and warned Garrett that if he died after all this paperwork, she would be furious in an administrative way. At 4:18 a.m., the convoy rolled out under a sky barely beginning to pale, chained tires biting through packed snow, while the cabin behind them glowed with federal lights and the fragile heat of a family remade. Inside the lead truck, Garrett drove with Wade beside him, an injured Malinois braced between the seats, and the unbearable knowledge that he had left his wife hours after she survived both assault and childbirth. Behind him, Elena held Hope against her chest and listened to the engines fade into the mountains, praying not for easy safety anymore, because that prayer belonged to a different life than hers. Patricia stayed behind as physician, guardian, and witness to the strange domestic battlefield the cabin had become, while Rachel's broader operation spread out through snow-dark roads toward politicians, offices, ledgers, and names long overdue for fear. The mountain road climbed into a colder blue as dawn thickened, and Garrett felt the mission narrowing from chaos into objective. Recover Sarah Klein, secure the records, take whoever still believed Snow could bury evidence quickly enough. Logan warned over comms that wind would worsen after sunrise, which meant the window was short, and the pass would soon choose its own side in the matter by shutting down movement altogether. Nobody in the truck answered for a moment, because every man inside knew the real deadline was not weather, but corruption learning how close the hunters had finally come. By the time White Elk Pass appeared ahead like a broken white scar through the trees, Garrett had become 3 people at once: a father, a husband, and the most dangerous witness Blackwood had not managed to erase. Winter had already tried to take his family in one form and then force them into new life in another. Now it would have to watch him climb back into its mountains and finish the accounting. White Elk Pass was less a road than the memory of one. An old maintenance cut through wind, buried switchbacks and mountain habits that punished anyone who confused map lines with mercy. Garrett drove the lead truck because he remembered where drifts formed over culverts, where ice pooled beneath powder, and where the pass had a long local tradition of lying about stable ground. Wade rode beside him, monitoring FBI traffic. Colt followed in the second vehicle with a thermal drone case, and Maverick stood between the seats with the determined posture of a dog unwilling to let injury revise assignment. Logan warned that satellite visibility was deteriorating and that the upper ridge would become nearly unusable within 90 minutes, which meant Blackwood's cleanup team and Garrett's response were racing the same weather. Garrett asked for movement on Sarah Klein, and Logan answered with no visual but fresh evidence that one cross-shell contractor had fueled equipment near the abandoned Alpine Survey Station weeks earlier. The first real sign came from Maverick, rather than the electronics, when the Malinois stiffened, lifted his nose into a crosswind, and gave one hard, alert pulse toward the left fork nobody local used in winter. Garrett killed the truck, watched the dog orient again toward the old rail approach, and trusted the judgment because Maverick had already proved that his instincts worked even when humans preferred denial. The team left the vehicles at the fork when the drifts became too deep, and Colt's drone failed twice in the wind before he packed it away with language not recommended in federal transcripts. So the climb became boots, breath, and field reading. Garrett moving first, Wade and the agents covering angles, Colt handling rear shifts, and Maverick working low through snow that should have shredded weaker scent trails completely. Garrett read compressed drifts, broken twigs, and knee slips in the path, while Maverick read what no satellite could see. Recent human fear, sweat under cold gear, fuel residue, and the direction of hasty movement. They found the first man tied to a stump 50 yards below the tunnel, one of Donovan's porch companions, half frozen and stripped of every ounce of entitled swagger he had worn at the cabin. Colt cut him loose while Garrett asked where Sarah Klein was, and the man answered through chattering teeth that she was inside the tunnel with Donovan, a senator's fixer, and records nobody had agreed on how to destroy. He added that Blackwood's side wanted no witnesses, and Donovan kept insisting his father had ordered only the papers burned, not the people, which was almost laughable as a moral distinction under mountain snow. Garrett ordered Agent Morales to get the man back down the pass alive, because frightened accomplices become useful truth-tellers once winter and jail strip away their illusions of immunity. The rail tunnel appeared around the next bend under half-buried timber braces and rusted track, generator hum bleeding out through the cold like a mechanical heartbeat trying not to be heard. Garrett reached the lip of the main chamber and saw the whole shape at once. Burn barrel, box stacks, portable heaters, armed guards, Sarah Klein zip-tied to a chair, Donovan pacing, and Blackwood holding a pistol as awkwardly as a man used to outsourcing courage. He slid back into cover and whispered the layout while Wade placed the agents. Colt moved toward the secondary maintenance slot, and everyone hoped frightened, powerful men would stay predictable for another 10 seconds. They did not, because a clump of snow slipped from the tunnel roof. One guard turned, and Maverick launched before any human could decide whether the breach belonged to tactics or instinct. The Malinois slammed high into the nearest guard and drove him into the burn barrel, sending sparks and half-burned papers into the air, while Wade tackled the second man before the rifle could rise. Garrett went straight for Blackwood, hit the senator's wrist as the wild shot fired, and pinned him against a support post while the pistol clattered across wet concrete and diesel grime. Blackwood demanded to know whether Garrett understood who he was, and Garrett answered that understanding exactly who he was explained the handcuffs now entering the room on federal timing instead of political schedule. Across the chamber, Donovan grabbed a hard drive case and 2 manila folders and bolted toward the snow shed exit, because cowardice often remembers self-preservation faster than loyalty. Colt cut him off through the side slot, shoving him into storage crates, but Donovan slipped past the impact and clawed through the next door toward the ridge platform above the drainage cut. One remaining guard lunged for Sarah Klein, either to use her as a shield or end the problem entirely, and Maverick intercepted again despite the bad ribs, locking onto the man's forearm with punishing precision. Sarah kicked her chair backward into the guard's knees at the same instant, and Wade finished the fight before cutting her restraints, proving that courage in county clerks often only needs one clean second to become visible. Garrett shoved Blackwood into Agent Dorsey's custody and followed Donovan into the snow shed, where the world narrowed to rotten planks, crosswind, black ice, and the sound of one desperate rich man discovering the mountains did not accept bribes. Donovan stumbled along the ridge shelf, clutching the drive case while the drainage below roared under broken ice, and for the first time since the porch, his body language looked less like arrogance than actual fear. Garrett told him to stop and hand over the drive, and Donovan screamed back that people like him never truly lost, because even on collapsing planks he still tried to negotiate with reality from a place of status. Garrett answered that people like Donovan only felt invincible while everyone else stayed frightened, and the sentence landed just as a rotten section of board split under Donovan's heel. The hard drive skidded free toward Garrett. Donovan plunged through the broken edge up to his chest, and the look on his face became suddenly, usefully human as the black water tried to drag him lower. Garrett went flat instantly and reached out while Donovan stared in disbelief, perhaps realizing too late that men trained for real honor often remain inconveniently moral, even toward enemies worth letting winter take. He asked Donovan for his hand, and when Donovan croaked why, Garrett answered, "Because I'm not you," which was less performance than the simplest truth available on that mountain. With Colt's help, he hauled Donovan back onto the planks, zip-tied his wrists, and told him he should thank Elena Stone because she had insisted every ending worth keeping had to be done the right way. Back inside the tunnel, Sarah Klein, wrapped in an emergency blanket, began identifying records with the furious efficiency of someone who had spent years touching the machinery of corruption without having the force to stop it publicly. She pointed out easements, payoff logs, replacement deed pages, shell ledger crosswalks, judicial donations disguised as foundation gifts, and Victor Cross's private black notebook, where initials turned lives into project obstacles. Rachel Foster arrived with additional agents 20 minutes later, took one look at Blackwood in custody, Donovan wrapped in thermal foil, Sarah alive, and the boxes under FBI lights, then informed Garrett that 4 hours without supervision had been obviously a mistake. Garrett said she should not have told him to move fast if she intended to sound surprised later, and even Rachel almost smiled, which on her counted as visible emotional surrender. Blackwood's composure finally cracked when Rachel reported that Victor Cross had been caught at a private airstrip trying to flee on a charity-owned jet, and that warrants were already hitting the company headquarters, county offices, and financial fronts. Maverick's adrenaline drained on the descent, and by the time they reached the trucks, Garrett carried him the last stretch, because even heroics eventually have to confess to bruised flesh and gravity. Sarah rode between evidence boxes in the second vehicle, refusing sedation because she wanted to stay awake long enough to hear at least one official arrest report read correctly in real time. On the way back, Logan announced that Blackwood, Victor, and Donovan were all in custody, that mirrored servers had preserved the company files, and that county hotlines were filling with tips from people who had feared speaking for decades. Wade laughed once from sheer exhaustion and said it looked like the silence had finally broken, and nobody in the vehicles disagreed because the sound of that brake was now moving through the whole state. Garrett looked over the valley, where dawn was flattening the snow into hard blue plains, and understood that the mountain mission had not won everything, but had saved the one thing corruption fears most: proof that survives the night. By the time the convoy rolled back toward Whispering Pines, the pass behind them already looked innocent again, as mountains always do after holding human evil for a few hard hours and then giving it back with interest. At the cabin, Elena stood on the porch with Hope in her arms and Patricia at her shoulder when the trucks pulled in, and Garrett felt more relief in that one sight than he had allowed himself all morning. He crossed the snow carrying Maverick, and Elena's eyes filled not because he had come home armed with success, but because he had come home at all after walking back into danger hours after their daughter's birth. Rachel told her that Sarah Klein was safe, the records were secure, and Blackwood had been taken in cuffs, which made Elena close her eyes once as if letting justice finally occupy the body where fear had been living. Hope slept through the entire briefing, a tiny, stubborn weight against Elena's chest, while the adults around her discussed raids, chains of evidence, financial seizures, and witness protection logistics under a clearing Montana sky. The county would still need trials, testimony, and time, but the mountain had surrendered the one thing Blackwood and Cross could not afford to lose: a documented path from private greed to public conspiracy. Winter had tried to bury that path under distance, snow, and influence, yet when the day finally opened over Whispering Pines, it illuminated exactly what Garrett, Elena, Maverick, and one frightened clerk had refused to let disappear. 3 months later, the federal courthouse in Helena smelled like wet wool, old wood, toner, and the strange seriousness that settles over buildings when a state finally starts prosecuting the lies it once protected. Outside, spring had only half defeated winter, leaving dirty ridges of snow in the gutters, while inside the Blackwood Cross trial turned one family's assault case into a map of county-wide corruption stretching back years. Victor Cross sat at the defense table in a conservative suite with no tie, looking older than his advertising ever had, as though stripped power exposes age faster than weather. Donovan sat nearby, thinner, quieter, and visibly bewildered by the basic civic idea that actions can return later, wearing verdict forms instead of paid silence. Harlan Blackwood kept his face composed in the polished way politicians learn for cameras, yet everyone in the room could now read that composure as habit rather than innocence. Garrett and Elena sat behind the prosecution team whenever Elena was not tending Hope, who had spent 13 days in neonatal care after her early arrival, but had already turned survival into routine with alarming confidence. Hope came home smaller than expected and stronger than anyone deserved, with Garrett's grip, Elena's dark hair, and a talent for choosing the least convenient moments to insist on being heard. Maverick lay at Garrett's feet during most proceedings, one faint limp remaining, and one scar hidden beneath his coat, an unobtrusive witness to the fact that heroism sometimes occupies exactly 15 square pounds of courtroom floor. When one defense attorney objected to the dog's presence, the new federal judge glanced toward Elena, and Elena answered before being asked that Maverick was the reason she remained alive to testify at all. The objection died quickly after that, because some truths make procedure look embarrassed in public, and there was no good response available on the record. Sarah Klein testified first, voice steady despite everything, and explained how archive pages had been swapped, easements quietly retyped, and historical transfer records manipulated whenever cross-development needed a property owner to appear weaker than reality allowed. She described the day Blackwood's people forced her to pull duplicate ledgers and how years of routine clerical unease finally made sense once she saw the burn setup in the mountain tunnel. Patricia Morgan took the stand next and translated bruises, fractured ribs, and canine trauma into medical language so clear that even the jury looked physically angered while listening. She also explained, with the dry confidence only Patricia could manage, that a dog does not acquire those injuries by misunderstanding a business meeting any more than a pregnant woman throws herself backward into a cabin wall voluntarily. Sheriff Dale Briggs lasted half a day under cross-examination before the contradictions cornered him, and the man who had spent years choosing convenience over courage finally admitted that cross calls changed how the county handled complaints. By the time he stepped down, Briggs no longer looked like a veteran lawman weathered by service. He looked like what he actually was, a bureaucrat who had rented out his badge one compromise at a time. The prosecution then opened the financial architecture, linking shell companies, subcontractor payments, campaign donations, zoning variances, settlement buyouts, insurance patterns, and county favors into one ugly system that had profited by keeping victims isolated from each other. Victor Cross held his silence for 11 trial days before his attorneys convinced him that Blackwood would gladly sacrifice him if preserving leverage required only one body instead of two. When Victor finally took the stand, the courtroom shifted in that hard-to-define way rooms do when a powerful man realizes the old script no longer protects him and begins speaking from raw self-preservation instead. He admitted that the stone parcel mattered because it completed the private lakefront footprint needed for the luxury resort, turning the last independent family on the shoreline into the final financial obstacle in a project measured in millions. When the prosecutor asked what happened after Elena refused, Victor called it poor judgment by his son. But then Garrett's quiet voice from the gallery cut across the space like wire. He almost killed my wife. Victor did not deny it, and the simple fact of hearing one powerful man fail to lie in public landed harder than any dramatic exchange the defense had prepared for. Blackwood never testified, choosing instead the old strategy of distance. But distance failed once prosecutors played the intercepted instructions, the payment routes, and the mountain communications showing he had ordered cleanup before daylight could reach the records. Cole Ramsey testified under agreement and described the cabin operation in contract language so cold that the jury seemed offended by the professionalism of his cruelty as much as the cruelty itself. When asked why he accepted a job targeting a pregnant civilian and a family home, he answered that men get good at calling evil billable, and the sentence followed him into every headline that week. The verdicts came on a Tuesday afternoon under a sky the color of meltwater, with Blackwood guilty on all counts, Victor guilty on racketeering and conspiracy, Donovan guilty on assault, extortion, unlawful detention, and connected charges, and Briggs guilty of corruption. Several county officials pleaded out. 2 judges faced separate indictment, and the network that had once looked untouchable on local roads now read like an anatomy chart pinned open under federal light. Outside the courthouse, microphones crowded the steps, but Garrett and Elena gave exactly one statement, because truth does not become stronger simply by repeating itself to more cameras. Garrett said the case had never been only about his family, and that courage belonged to everyone who finally chose not to stay silent, which mattered because silence had been the real currency of the cross machine. Elena held hope beneath a cream wool wrap and added that courage sometimes looks like a county clerk keeping copies, a veterinarian refusing to soften facts, or a dog standing in the snow when every larger creature would prefer retreat. That clip traveled almost as far as the winter live stream, not because it was louder, but because people recognize honest relief when they hear it spoken by survivors instead of commentators. The truest ending, however, did not happen in court. It happened back in Whispering Pines, when families who had spent years whispering finally walked uphill toward the stone cabin, carrying lumber, tools, sandwiches, generators, and stories. 47 households came over 2 weekends, some because cross-pressure had burned them once already, some because shame had lasted too long, and some because one family's refusal to fold had embarrassed them into finally becoming brave. Ezra Whitfield, 79 years old, and still harder than seasoned cedar, brought a carved lantern post for the rebuilt dock and admitted that his own son had died years earlier after refusing a cross-linked sail. Garrett handed Ezra nails and took the confession without theatrics, because men in grief do not always need speeches. Sometimes they only need someone to hold the board steady while they finally speak. The new porch came together wider and stronger than the old one. The dock was reinforced, the windows improved, and the nursery finally received the paint samples Garrett had once argued about like they were tactical disagreements. Maverick supervised the work from a blanket until strength returned enough for him to limp room to room, checking every threshold personally, as if renovation itself required canine approval before becoming official. The idea for Guardian K9 came months later at sunset, when Garrett and Elena stood on the rebuilt dock, with Hope asleep in a carrier, and stared across the lake at the seized Cross headquarters. Elena said that building had taken enough from people and ought to be made useful now, and Garrett understood immediately because transformation is the only answer strong enough to outlast revenge. Patricia agreed to help screen rescue dogs. Wade offered to train veterans in confidence and movement. Colt volunteered for field exercises. Logan built the system backbone. And Rachel quietly accelerated the paperwork no one admitted she influenced. Victor Cross's former office became a training room. Conference spaces once used for bribes hosted support groups and obedience classes, and the Lakeview Administrative Wing began serving people it had once threatened. They named it the Guardian K9 Initiative because the best memorial to winter's violence was not a plaque or slogan, but a practical place where rescue dogs and wounded veterans could learn purpose together. Elena finished the children's book she had started before the attack and titled it Maverick the Brave, turning one small dog's refusal to surrender into a story children could carry without needing to understand subpoenas or shell companies. Every royalty dollar went into Guardian K9, and the first class of veterans and rescue dogs proved almost immediately that broken things, given patience and work, frequently become something stronger than the world expected. On the first anniversary of the attack, the town gathered at the cabin again, but this time no sirens came. Only children on the porch, veterans with dogs, neighbors talking openly, and the dock lantern burning against dusk. Sarah Klein cut a ribbon on the program trailer. Rachel attended off-duty. Patricia tried not to cry. Wade failed not to look proud. And Colt claimed he was only there for logistics, despite smiling too much to be believed. Hope took early steps across the new porch, while Maverick shadowed every wobble like a gray-muzzled guardian, appointed directly by history, and Elena laughed in the exact place where she had once bled and refused to sign. Garrett stood with her at the dock as evening settled over Whispering Pines, and understood that justice had not erased the winter. It had answered it, named it, and then built something on the other side strong enough to remain. The lake reflected the lantern. The mountains watched without comment, and the family that corruption tried to isolate now stood at the center of a community that had finally relearned how to stand together. Sometimes God does not send miracles as thunder from the sky. Sometimes he sends them as courage in a wounded family, loyalty in a dog that refuses to run, truth in ordinary people who finally decide silence is too expensive, and mercy in the chance to rebuild what evil tried to steal. If this story moved you, please share it, leave a comment, and subscribe to K9 and Seal Stories. May God bless your home, protect the people you love, and remind you that even in the coldest night, light still matters, truth still matters, and brave hearts can still change everything.